on Facebook right now. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your brother Garfield, and I do have my esteemed guest tonight is Dr. Richard Carrier, a gentleman who I've respected and studied over the years as far as my growth is concerned, as far as dealing with the historicity of Jesus, but also studies in the New Testament and looking at different things differently from a Old Testament or a New Testament point of view. So he's a well-studied man. He is actually a graduate of Columbia University. If I'm incorrect, correct me, Dr. Carrier. And he has been doing this for years, and he's been in a couple of debates. But I know recently he wrote a book on the historicity of Jesus. He also was a special writer, I'll say special writer, in the book on the quest for the historical Jesus debate when they responded to Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and actually that second chapter that's actually the only chapter I read in that book, to be honest with you. It was the one that you touched on his errors. So I want to say a big shout out to the YouTube family. I want to give a big shout out to the Facebook family. We're going to be on Facebook for like 20 minutes, and I'm encouraging everybody to go to the Brother Garfield live channel. And after this, I'm going to actually upload it to my bigger channel, which is the Dagger Squad YouTube channel. All right. I actually was going to cancel the interview because my other channel is down from going live, but I was able to build up this channel to get a little audience. So I said, let me do it and just upload it on the other channel because the chance to actually interview you is an honor. And I just want to say that you're respected, all over the world as a scholar. So go ahead, my brother. Introduce yourself, my brother.
Yeah, I'm Richard Carrier, PhD in ancient history from Columbia University, and I've written a lot of books and research articles and things on a variety of subjects, but including ancient science most recently, and most famously, the historicity of Jesus.
Beautiful. How hard is it for you studying at Columbia? How hard was it for you to get into what a methodology is as far as studying and coming to a conclusion? How hard it is for you knowing that you have a certain bias going into school? Like, did you ever believe Jesus was actually a person that walked on the earth 2,000 years ago the way it's described in the Bible? Did at any time in your life did you believe that?
Well, I mean, yes, not the way it's described in the Bible, of course. I was a mainstreamer. I took the same view that Bart Ehrman and many other scholars do, which is that Jesus was just an ordinary guy around whom legends grew. And so the gospel Jesus is a mythical Jesus. Everybody other than fundamentalists agrees that's the case. And so the question was, well, but was there at least just some guy, an ordinary guy around whom these legends got spun? Or was that even not a real thing? Was it originally, was he just someone that you encountered in visions or dreams and someone you knew from scripture, but not someone that you actually met in person? And eventually, so that was my position for a while. And I thought people who challenged the historicity of Jesus were, basically cranks, essentially. And in fact, all the way through most of grad school, it was not until towards the end of that that I got to the point where I realized that there's actually sound reasons to doubt, but I still wasn't fully convinced that we should doubt. And then when I got my PhD in 2008, I asked my fans to help fund my research on anything they wanted, and they chose historicity of Jesus. And so I did that research project for 6 years, and I came out on the other side of that research project even more convinced that the historicity of even an ordinary Jesus is doubtful. We can't be sure for certain. Like I come out with the highest probability of 1 in 3, which is still a respectable chance that there was some guy behind it all. But it's still it's not above 50%, which is what freaks people out. So people get really surprised and shocked that I dared to find that the probability is as low as 1 in 3, which is not even that low, but it's too low for them.
Hey, Richard, they're saying that your mic is kind of muffled on the Facebook feed, but you know what I'm going to do, family? For who's on Facebook? All right, what I'm going to do, family, on Facebook, I'm going to cut the stream off. You guys got to come to the YouTube. So let's just, maybe that has a lot to do with it. Because he sounds clear on the YouTube. So, all right. So for those who are watching on Facebook, I'm just going to stop the live stream there. And then you guys could carry on and listen on the YouTube. All right. So I'm going to end the live stream on Facebook, family. and just keep the YouTube alone. All right. So if you want to catch the show, the rest of the show, just tune in on Google Hangouts. All right, on YouTube. All right. Okay. So let me do this here. Let me cut this off. All right. So there's no confusion. All right. So peace to the
Okay.
family in the chat. You sound clear here. You sound pretty clear here. Let me see how the YouTube. The YouTube, does he sound pretty clear in the YouTube family?
All right. Now I'm gonna say some words so you can tell. Mic check. Mic check.
All right. There you go. There you go.
Sounds good.
All right. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sounds pretty well. All right. So, and by the way, audience, if you do have a question for Dr. Richard Carrier, you guys could call in, and or if you have a question in the chat, because I'm not sharing my screen on Google Hangout. So I mean, I'm here watching the YouTube right now, so we could get some questions in if anybody has a question. All right. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what type of methodology did you use as far as coming to your conclusions of where you are? Because you said you had a probability of 1 in 3, and I respect that. I respect that a lot, because the way how the story is put together, it's hard to say he completely did not exist, but they must have been either a figure, it must have been some other tradition, because when I look at somebody like Glycon in the 2nd century, his storyline and Alexander and all his prophecies came through, and a lot of people in my community don't know about Glycon.
That's right. That's a good example.
But pretty much Glycon was a Jesus. But the truth of the matter is, Alexander, every prophecy came true, because Alexander, of course, manufactured them, and it ends up that Glycon was just a damn snake, just a snake. So tell us about the methodology and how you came to these conclusions.
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I did when I got the research grant to do this project, to do this research, the first thing you do when you get a project like this is you work on methodology, figure that out. So I went to the sources, went to the scholarship, said, well, what are the methods they're using in Jesus studies? Up to this point, I was very well read and studied extensively historical methodologies in general, especially in ancient history. But this, for Jesus studies, I went and studied those methods as well. So I had all of these sort of wide range of methods that are kind of standard in among historians, and then the methods specifically that have been developed relatively recently in Jesus studies, and then read all of the studies about those studies. So there were actually several studies by Jesus historians specifically and solely about the methodologies being used in Jesus studies. This include books and journal articles, peer-reviewed books and journal articles, and every single one of them that was a dedicated study of the methods found that those methods don't work, that they're either invalid or they're invalidly applied. And so I realized, well, that's not going to work. And but at the same time, I was coming to realize that history is about probability. It's all about how probable are certain things, which things are more probable than other things, how probable are they? And if you're going to talk about probability, you have to start looking at the logic of how do you get a conclusion that has a probability? How do you determine this? What is the logical formula for this? And through a bunch of other circumstances, I discovered that actually Bayesian reasoning is the correct way to do it. I mean, the CIA uses this. The archaeologists are using it now. And so what I did is I sort of developed, well, how does this explain standard historical methodologies? What can we learn from this method? How can we use it for historians? Because we don't have scientifically precise data. So it's not that kind of a method. It's not a statistical study kind of thing. It's a probability theory thing. It's a logic thing. And so I wrote my first book. First product of my research project on this was Proving History, Bayes' Theorem, and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. And that was basically on the methods, how they work, why they explain all valid historical methods, and how they explain why the experts in Jesus studies found that Jesus studies methods don't work. So you can actually analyze those methods using Bayes' theorem to show what's really going on here. Why do these methods not work? Why aren't they applicable? And once I developed the methodology, I applied it. So when you see the next book, which is On the Historicity of Jesus, that's the final book, the last one that capped the project, that really applies this method to the question of the historicity of Jesus. And that's where I end up finding a wide margin of error, but the top of the margin of error was 1 in 3. Highest probability, I think, could reasonably be believed for the historicity of an ordinary Jesus.
Okay, beautiful. Let me run down a few questions that people might have. So let me just get them out the way real quickly, because the common person in the African American community, Jesus believers are like at probably they were like at 95%. Now it's about probably 85. A lot of people going back to African spirituality and following
Mhm.
different traditions. So that has broken down for a little bit. But Jesus
Yeah.
has been the main man in the African American community.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
it's hard to come to somebody who actually has been believing this for years. Their great grandmother, the grandmother,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
mother, and now they. So let me ask you this now. How do we challenge? You did an article on Tacitus years ago saying that it possibly was an error by the person who wrote by Tacitus at the time. You don't. I think if I remember correctly, you said it wasn't a forgery, but you feel like when the person was copying it, they probably made an error in copying. And what I'm talking about is
Yeah.
Tacitus referring to, let me just tell you my personal thing with the whole Tacitus thing is, if he's talking about Jesus Christ, why did he write Christians? Because I think that was erased by Christians later on. And what do you feel about the whole Tacitus?
Yeah, there's a lot about that. Yeah, there's one passage in the Annals of Tacitus where Tacitus says, and then Nero scapegoated the Christians and blamed this arson crime on the Christians and engaged in basically publicly executing them in horrible ways to try and pass blame onto them for the burning of Rome. And there's a one line in there where Tacitus says, yeah, and these Christians are named after Christ, who was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and a few other things. But it's very basic description. Now, if Tacitus wrote that the way we have it, he's writing in 116 AD. It's already almost 100 years after the fact. And his most likely source would have been his buddy, Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was governing a province right near where Tacitus was, and they were exchanging letters on their histories. And we know Pliny didn't know anything about Christians and interrogated some Christians, and he says, oh, it was just some ridiculous superstition, and that they worship this God named Christ. He doesn't give any details about historical Jesus or anything like that. But that's the most likely place Tacitus would have learned it. So it would have been Christians talking to Pliny, and those Christians just would have been repeating the Gospels at him. So Tacitus doesn't really corroborate the Gospels. He's just basically all he attests is that the Gospels were circulating by that time, which we already know is true. That's really, you could stop there. But there's actually evidence to suggest, quite a lot of evidence actually, to suggest that Tacitus never wrote that one line about Christ being crucified by Pontius Pilate was actually inserted later. It may have been inserted deliberately, it's possible, but it might also have been inserted by accident, because there's a very common error we know in manuscript transmission where scholars will write a note or something to themselves in the margins of a book. If you own a book, and if you probably yourself may have scribbled, your own little notes and words in the margins of the book. But when books were hand copied, that looked exactly the same way as accidentally omitted text. So if a scribe left a line out, they would put it in the margins, and then when it gets copied again, they'd put it back in. But those notes often look identical. So oftentimes these little scholarly notes to themselves get inserted because the next scribe thinks that was accidentally omitted text. And so they think they're fixing the text by putting it back in. They don't realize that that's not actually original text. And so we have lots and lots of examples of this happening in texts all throughout the ancient world. And so that could have happened in this case, because it is one short, brief line. It's fairly simple. It could have been someone thinking, well, this must be the Christians. And so he puts the line, sort of a friendly note to someone about, oh, this is the Christ that was executed by Pontius Pilate. But that might not have been the case. It might have originally been the case that Tacitus was either did not talk about Christ specifically, or he was talking about a completely different group, the Christians, which were actually this Jewish messianic group that were not related to the Christians. We don't really know, right? So the evidence, the original manuscripts, all of this stuff have been lost. We don't have early quotations of Tacitus, no one discussing it. So we don't know. But the evidence is very suspicious. And so the whole passage is marginally useful, actually, in the long run.
What do you think about David Fitzgerald's angle, where he talks about different people who actually fits, in some sense, the career of this biblical well, I don't know if career is the best word to use, but to say the historical value of those real people who we find, who there's documentation of, and if you took pieces out of their lives, like Jesus Benanias. How do you feel about him? I think that's who Bart Ehrman, if I remember correctly, feels might fit the Jesus guy or the Jesus of the gospel.
Yeah, I mean, Ehrman probably didn't say that is the origin of the legend of Jesus, or the origin of Christianity. It's a different Jesus for sure. Now, this other guy, his name is Jesus ben Ananias, and he was this Jewish kind of like this crazy guy who was apocalyptic prophet. But he lived and was tried under the procurator of Judea, or the prefect of Judea, in the 60s AD. So this is like 30 years after Christianity had already been created and was being spread all over. So it's a different guy, and he gets killed by an artillery stone, crushes him by the walls of Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem. But there's a lot of points of similarity in the trial and crucifixion record of Jesus, where there's plot points basically are taken. There's about 20 different plot points that are in the same order between his story and the Jesus story that ends up in the Gospel of Mark. So there have been several scholars who've written peer-reviewed articles arguing that it does look like when Mark was composing it, he needed to come up with a story of Jesus. He borrowed this story of Jesus ben Ananias for part of his storyline. And so he used that. Now that just means that the gospel legend of Jesus is partly based on Jesus ben Ananias, but Jesus ben Ananias had nothing to do with Christianity. He wasn't the founder of Christianity. He wasn't a Christian himself. And there are other examples of that. When we know, for example, Mark and especially Matthew, and then later Luke, are using Moses and Elijah and Elisha as models. So a lot of the storyline of Jesus is actually just a rewrite of Moses, Elijah, and Elisha. And we know they were borrowing other ideas from other people from the time. And there are a variety of these other messianic figures, other people who were not Christians, who had similar storylines where they would like make these predictions. They would end up getting themselves killed in the long run. And so there are similarities, and there are probably a bunch of different people that were used as models to assemble the fictional Jesus later, which is true even if there was a historical Jesus, because the stories about Jesus are still fiction, are still mythical, even if there was a real Jesus they were writing about. Excuse me.
Hey, bless you. Old fashioned bless you. Let's look at somebody already asked about Jesus ben Ananias, but what do you have to say about the whole Christus and Christians thing? Because I noticed in the Codex Sinaiticus they have Christians instead of Christians for all the references to Christians. Is it really is it a big deal? Is it a big deal?
Not really. I don't think so. There was a shift in the dialect, the actual spoken dialect of Greek, where the accenting of Greek was changing. And so the letters eta and the letters iota started sounding very similar. So you find a lot of switching between them in texts. So Christians would actually be what they would audibly hear when they see Christians, but not realizing that those are two different words. So that kind of crept into the evidence here and there. But I don't think that's significant. We also know there was a group who was following this other guy named Chrestus. So there would have been Christians, which is a different group. So there could easily be confusion between these two different groups. We don't have enough of the primary evidence to actually sort this out as to where and when all this stuff started getting mixed up and confused.
Yeah, because I think Tertullian had wrote about, at times people were referring to Christians instead of Christians and all that stuff. So it obviously was an issue. It obviously was.
Yeah.
What do you think about Tertullian disavowing from Christianity, of what he would call Christianity in that day? Because I don't think Christianity in that 200 AD is the same as what we would probably call it today. I don't think.
Yeah. There are a lot of ways in which the Christianity that Tertullian was selling was not the Christianity of Paul, for example, or even the Christianity of the original apostles. Like Paul's Christianity was not the original Christianity. I mean, Paul is saying you don't have to be a Jew to be a Christian, and that was a radical new idea. That wasn't the idea that the first apostles were teaching. They were teaching you could only be a Christian if you converted to Judaism, which meant you had to circumcise yourself, you had to follow Jewish dietary laws. You basically had to become a Jew, otherwise you weren't a real Christian. And the Gospel of Matthew is written by this sect of Christians who actually don't like this idea that you can be a Christian without being a Jew. So the Gospel of Matthew kind of rewrites Mark and has Jesus say, no, you've got to, every single bit of the law is still going to keep going on. You can't actually skip it. So it's really kind of like portraying this idea that you have to be a Jew actually to be a Christian. The Book of Revelation is another example. That's written by the same faction. They're not pro-Gentile Christian. They're very much, you want to be saved, you want to be a Christian, you've got to be a Jew.
Okay. All right. So let's take a look at some of the issues here. What about Suetonius and I think he had talked about something to do with Christ, and he's one of the people that many people like to bring up. What do you think about Suetonius and what's the guy in the 2nd century that followed Glycon's thing? I forgot his name.
Oh, that'd be Lucian of Samosata.
There you go. What do you think about those?
Well, Lucian, that's not useful because Lucian's writing in the 160s AD. So this is already over 100 years later. And it's clear his source of information is only the Gospels and what Christians are claiming then. He had no other access to any 1st century information. So all he's doing is repeating what Christians were telling him, and they're just repeating what their Gospel said. So we can't really cite Lucian for any useful information other than for information about what Christianity was preaching in the 160s AD. Lucian, by the way, was the best friend of Celsus, who wrote the first that we know of, the first monumental treatise against Christianity, which the Christians destroyed. And we only know pieces of it, quotations of it, through Origen, the Christian scholar Origen in the 3rd century, because he quotes Celsus in his book against Celsus. His refutation was preserved, and so we have some of the quotations of the original critique, but the original critique was destroyed and is gone. But so Lucian knew Celsus, and we can tell from Celsus, all of Celsus's information comes entirely from the canonical Gospels, the four Gospels. He has no other information; he's getting it from nowhere else. So we know that they don't have access to any independent information.
Beautiful.
When we look at Suetonius, so Suetonius is writing about 120 AD, and there's 2 references that people point to. One, he just says Nero persecuted the Christians. He doesn't say anything about Jesus or anything more specific. And then there's a passage where he talks about Chrestus, this Jewish riot instigator in Rome under Claudius. This is about 20 years after Christianity began, after our Jesus would be dead. And it's very clear that Suetonius knows about Christians. He talks about them in another passage, but he does not clearly know anything about Jesus Christ as the Judean founder of Christianity. He's writing about some other guy named Chrestus who was alive 20 years later and in Rome, not in Judea, and instigating riots there. And he was very much associated with Judaism. So Suetonius thinks that this is a Jewish rioter. So clearly Suetonius didn't have any reliable information about Jesus either. At least certainly doesn't record any.
Hey, what do you think? This is a little bit, it's on topic. It's around the time period about 70 AD and the Exiles. A lot of writings have come out recently. There was a book called The Myth of the Exile and some other writings. Even Shlomo Sand in his book about the Jews being not the true Jews or whatever.
I haven't heard about this. This is news to me.
Shlomo, what's his name? Shlomo Sand. What's the name of his book? Let me find it right now. I was actually reading a piece of it earlier too. Let me tell you what the name of his book is. He actually is a well-hated man in Israel right now. The Invention of the Jewish People.
I just looked it up. No, I've not read this. Shlomo Sand, The Invention of the Jewish People.
Yeah, he he wrote on a lot of stuff of how there was a lot of converts with the Carthaginians and so forth.
He's a professor at Tel Aviv University. It's interesting. No, I haven't read it, so I don't know anything about it. But what does he say in this?
Well, he basically talks about that the people who are in Israel today are not the real Jews. Like genetically, you couldn't trace them back to the people that were there. These people who moved back to Israel, he's saying majority of them, if not all of them, are basically converts. So he broke down the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians.
Okay.
Because the Jewish religion had a lot to do with trade, and that the Hebrew language had a lot to do with trade, and the Jews were
right. So when you have the exiles, you have a lot of interracial marriage and stuff going on. So and there were a lot of converts. Mm-hmm. So I can't really comment on the validity of his argument because I don't know the evidence he's presented.
You know what you just did though, Richard? You just did something that my community needs to see. You just said that you have not read his book, so you won't comment on his book. And a lot of us in our community, we like to talk about stuff we haven't read. So I'm glad you actually did. I'm glad you just did that. Well, keep on, brother. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's it. I mean, but it sounds initially plausible in a way that other things I've heard don't sound plausible at all. Now, the current mainstream consensus is that what we mean by Jews are actually just a tribe of Canaanites that were always there and just basically wiped out the other Canaanites.
Mm-hmm.
So the question becomes, like, how far back do you have to go to be, quote unquote, an authentic one? Because nothing in the Old Testament actually happened, or at least nothing in the Pentateuch, the first
Mm-hmm.
5 books of the Bible, actually happened. So there was no Abraham, there was no Moses, like all of the stuff that you think is like fundamental Judaism. Jews didn't really exist in that sense, because those stories are fake, and they were written hundreds of years later. So how far back would you need to go to say, like, oh, that real Jew? You're only a real Jew if you go back this far. I don't know. It starts to become meaningless. It's kind of like the Southern attempt to define, in the U.S., to define black as if you have even one drop of African blood, then you're a black man. And like,
Yeah.
that's everybody.
Let me ask you this. You just said you never read his book, but basically what you just said is what is in his book. That's
Okay,
amazing.
yeah. Well,
That's
no, all
amazing.
I said is it's plausible. Now, whether he makes the case with evidence or not, that's different. But yeah. But yeah, no, it's a question of like, how far back do you got to go? Certainly there's going to be a lot of mixing. But the question is how much, and then like, what would it even mean to say like you're not a real Jew in modern Israel? If you're going to have descendants, you're going to have genes from that go that far back, right? So like you actually might. It's like saying you're not a real African if you don't have exactly the same genetic code of current modern day Africans. But no, if you have genes that go back there, you've got ancestors that go back there like that. So that becomes the question of how much DNA do you have to have of what model? Like, what is he saying is like the fundamental requirement? So there are a lot of questions I have about how he gets to that statement. But there are plausibilities in there, and so it's certainly an argument worth looking at.
Do you think the argument of I think it was Frank Zindler, he had printed out a back and forth he had with Bart Ehrman, and they were talking about the place called Nazareth.
Yeah.
And I think one of his arguments is which was a good argument, is that Josephus actually named the towns, I think in Galilee, all of them, and Nazareth was not one, because actually, I mean, we're gonna get into Josephus a little bit more after this, but what do you feel about that argument about the place called Nazareth not existing?
Yeah, I don't find that convincing there. I think there's sufficient evidence to believe that Nazareth did exist. And all of the arguments against it are not logically sound arguments. Now, it's possible it didn't exist. We don't have slam dunk evidence that there was a Nazareth in the time of Jesus. But I don't think the evidence against it is particularly strong. To case in point is Josephus, who was a general. He actually was governor of Galilee in the 60s AD. He says there are like 200 towns in Galilee, but in the course of his writings, he only names 70 of them, something like 70. So there's 130 towns he didn't name. So Nazareth could easily be one of those. So that's not a particularly strong argument. That's an example of that's not a good argument from science.
Right. Hey, let me say this also regarding that Nazareth point. I don't think I'm saying, or he's saying that the place didn't exist. I think he's saying that the name didn't exist, but you just enlightened me on something I wasn't aware of.
It's the same thing. Well, we know it did because we have now. There have been attempts to sort of claim this is a forgery, but there's no evidence that's the case. We found an inscription which records a text of all the houses, all the towns that took in Jewish priests when the temple was destroyed. Now that means 70 AD because there was no temple after 70 AD and no priesthood. So the priests had to be dispersed. They lived in the temple originally, but now the temple's gone. Jerusalem has been razed. And so they had to be taken in. And so there were a list of towns that took in these priests. And Nazareth, the spelling and everything is actually in Hebrew, is on this list as one of the towns that took in priests. Now, this text has to originate in the 70s AD. So that means there was a town named Nazareth in the 70s AD in Judea or in that area that could take in priests. And it was not, it couldn't be too hick, like it was large enough or successful enough that priests would deign to settle there. So it seems very unlikely that town could have just suddenly been made after 30 AD, for example, or in the first century. It's possible, though. It's possible Nazareth was created or re-inhabited in the lifetime of Jesus, and Jesus just wasn't born there, or it was re-inhabited and rebuilt up shortly after Jesus died. Like that's possible, but we just don't have evidence confirming this storyline. So I don't think that's a strong argument. And also, I don't think there's a strong argument that even if Jesus existed, that he was born at Nazareth. I find that also a weak argument. So this idea that we can argue that Jesus didn't exist if Nazareth didn't exist is not true, because we know mainstream scholars agree that Jesus wasn't born at Bethlehem either. So it doesn't matter whether the towns exist or not. These authors are putting them in their gospels to match prophecy. I mean, Matthew says that there was some sort of scripture that he had access to that said Jesus would be a Nazorian, and so he says that's why he was believed to be from Nazareth. And so they're actually looking for towns to sort of assign to him through scriptures rather than actual remembered history. So I don't think the historicity of Nazareth is actually even relevant to the historicity of Jesus. I don't think even if there was a Jesus, I don't think he was born at Nazareth either. Whether there was a Nazareth or not, therefore, it doesn't matter.
All right, good point. Good point. All right, let's get to some stuff that the audience is asking real quickly. Let me see here. No, we don't want to talk about, so Abraham didn't exist. Okay. All right. I got to go to one of my questions then because I don't see any questions in the chat. All right. So when you look at the consensus regarding the existence of Jesus, I remember Josephus talked about 4 different groups that existed. And I think it was around 53 AD. He was writing on the different groups of Christians that existed. And I think the groups, it was like a 4th group. Am I mixing up with something?
Okay, no, here. I know where you're going.
Right.
So Josephus writes about sects of Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And he says there are 4 major sects of Jews. We know there are actually about 10 to 30 different sects with Judaism, but most of them are minor and fringe. And Josephus just says, well, the big 4, the big major ones, are the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and what he calls the 4th philosophy, which we now dub the Zealots, which are these kind of like political radicals.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells us about their teachings. He tells us about something about them and features them in his histories, which is one of the reasons I think that he never mentioned Christianity, really. There's a paragraph about Jesus in the Antiquities of the Jews. It's the only place where he mentions Christianity specifically. There's one other passage where he supposedly references a James, the brother of a so-called Christ. But there are reasons to doubt that passage too. But the main one, the big paragraph, is clearly a forgery. There's been tons of evidence, and more evidence has accumulated over time. So like even since 2014, multiple articles have been published further sealing the deal that this paragraph is not written by Josephus. But one of the reasons we know that, among like 50 reasons that we know that this wasn't written by Josephus, is that he doesn't describe the teachings of this sect. This is what he does when he runs into a sect of Jews and wants to talk about them. He describes their beliefs and actually talks about the sect in a certain particular way. He doesn't do that in this paragraph. So this paragraph clearly was not written by Josephus. If he was to write about Christianity, he would have written about what beliefs they had, how they fit into this picture of the 4 major sects of Judaism and so on. He would have integrated this into his history. But the paragraph doesn't do that. It's just sort of this sort of little tiny encapsulated creedal statement that could only come from the hand of a Christian.
All right. I have a question in the chat. Ask Dr. Carrier if he's still looking to debate Bart Ehrman.
I would indeed. Bart Ehrman has said he won't debate me because I'm too mean. Obviously he's not looked at any of my actual debates, and I've done tons. Many of these debates are available. You can find them on YouTube and so forth. No, in debates, I have a particular mode of scholarly operation and calm seriousness. So there isn't any reason for him to think that I'm going to be mean to him, other than the fact that I am going to actually refute some of the things he says, which I think is the real thing that concerns him. He did debate Robert Price, and I wrote a review showing how that debate went awry and how actually a lot of things Ehrman said are actually false, and that Price didn't challenge him on. But I would certainly have challenged him on those things. And it's entirely possible Ehrman doesn't want to be challenged on those things, and that's one of the main reasons why he doesn't want to debate me.
When I read his book, Did Jesus Exist? And then I read your book and how you critiqued it in that second chapter in that book, the compilation with different people.
Yes.
The late D.M. Murdoch, who's called Achara S.
Yes.
Robert Price, a couple other people.
Zindler as well. Yeah.
Zindler. And I noticed, and I'm looking at all the things that you pointed out that he made errors in, and I'm like, whoa. I would have never even looked at these, and of course you you're a guy who have your PhD and you know how to dissect things probably better than anybody else in this field. But what do you feel? One of the things that a lot of Christians hold on to is Ignatius.
Yes.
And the fact that he was traveling. I thought your explanation is just superb. But going a little bit on Ignatius.
Gosh, yeah, there's a lot to say about this. Probably one of the best things. So for people who want to find out more about my work and my books and everything, Twitter feed, Facebook feed, all of that, go to richardcarrier.info. That's .info. And at richardcarrier.info, it's my blog. It's got all the other stuff too, links to my books and things. But I have a blog there about, I can't remember the exact title, but it's how did Christianity switch to a historical Jesus? And one of the things, in fact, you could probably type in Ignatius in the search screen, and it'll probably bring this article up, because I have a section on Ignatius where I really focus in on this as why it's actually suspicious and weird. Now, Ignatius is an author who claims in the current version of the text we have. Now, there are multiple versions of the Ignatian text. So there are people doctoring and forging and altering Ignatian material over time. So we actually have multiple different versions. So this is not a very reliably transmitted text already. So we're already on alert for suspicions here. But in the text, the main text that we have preserved, it basically says, it references the fact that he was writing under the reign of Trajan, which is, so people usually date him to about 110 AD, give or take a few years, because he talks about being arrested for being a Christian and then being brought from one Christian community to another on his way to trial by his Roman captors. Now, several scholars have pointed out this is a massively implausible narrative, and there's no way this could be true. There's no way Romans would arrest a Christian for being an illegal Christian and then take him peacefully to Christian church after Christian church and let him mingle and talk and share letters with these Christians and then keep going without arresting all these other Christians. So the storyline that's in it is ridiculous. And there's been several Ignatian experts, and I quote them and cite them in my book on the historicity of Jesus. For those who want to know, On Historicity of Jesus is the one you're talking about, which is the really detailed book on this question. It's the first peer-reviewed book to examine the historicity of Jesus, specifically published in almost 100 years, pro or con, by the way. So it's even Ehrman's "Did Jesus Exist" was not published through peer review; it was published in a pop market press. But in my book on the historicity of Jesus, I cite these scholars pointing this out, that they think the Ignatian letters were actually probably written more like in the 140s, somewhere give or take a few years there, and only portrayed this story. They're kind of like a fictional series of letters to kind of portray a Christian martyr and push these teachings. And so the point being is that this is already, even at 110, it's already too late. He's just relying on the Gospels. But if it goes as late as 130 or 140, it's definitely just way too late to be useful as a citation for evidence for Jesus, because there's nothing in Ignatius that doesn't come out of the Gospels, other than things that actually sound like Jesus didn't exist, which I also talk about in chapter 8 of On the Historicity of Jesus. So I don't think Ignatius is a reliable or useful source for defending historicity by any means.
All right, well said. There's a gentleman asking about a proto-Christian cult that you talk about in most of your lectures. Please ask Dr. Carrier about the initial angel cult that existed before the idea of Jesus.
Okay, yeah.
Talking about wow, what is the name of that? But go ahead, talk about it. Go ahead.
Well, I assume they mean what I suspect, and I'm not the only one. There are a few other scholars too, and I got the idea from previous scholar who wasn't a PhD scholar, but he was had a BA in classics and actually wrote the first plausible defense of the non-existence of Jesus, and that's Earl Doherty. He wrote the book The Jesus Puzzle. Now, there are a lot of flaws, I thought, in the Jesus Puzzle, but I think he was hitting on something that was probably correct, or most likely correct. And that is that the original Christian sect, their Jesus Christ was an angelic figure. It was actually a pre-existent archangel that God had clothed with flesh so that he could die and his death would atone for all sins. And then he's re-exalted and assigned all the powers of God. And this is already in Paul. This is in Philippians 2. Jesus is a pre-existent being who assumes flesh and is crucified. And there are many other references in Paul to Jesus being a pre-existent being. So they definitely viewed him as this. And in the books of Philo is Judaeus, is this he's a Jewish theologian, the most famous Jewish theologian, contemporary of Paul. He's writing in the 20s, 30s, 40s AD. In the writings of Philo, he references this angel constantly. He says it has all the same attributes as the Christian Jesus. It says the Christians clearly thought their Jesus was this archangel. And that's true even if Jesus was a historical person. That's really important to emphasize, is that even the first Christians, and Bart Ehrman has come out admitting this now in his book, How Did Jesus Become God? It says the first Christians right out of the bat thought that their Jesus was this pre-existent archangel who became incarnate and died. And that's what they were teaching all along from the beginning. Now the alternative theory is that that's all they were teaching, that there wasn't a guy that they thought was this archangel, that there was only this archangel, and that they only learned about his incarnation and death through visions in scripture. They didn't actually meet this guy or see this incarnation or death. And that's the mythicist thesis, I think, is the most plausible theory for the origins of Christianity without an actual Jesus. And this would have been the original sect up until we're not sure when. Sometime after the Jewish War, it does appear. We have some documents that appear to be written before that war. First Clement, Hebrews, for example. They also seem to lack any clear reference to a historical Jesus in the earthly sense. They all seem to think there's only a cosmic Jesus. He's historical, but in the same way that Satan is historical, that they live in the upper reaches of the air and in the heavens and stuff. They're not earthly historical human beings in the normal sense. And so something happened around the Jewish War. Right after that, suddenly we start getting these Gospels. The first one is Mark, that are highly allegorical, highly mythical, don't seem to have any sources. They don't claim to have any sources. They're just writing these some sort of symbolic narratives portraying Jesus as a normal person with miraculous powers walking through Galilee and then so on, and being crucified by Pontius Pilate and all of that. It's only in the second half of the first century that we start hearing this as even an idea within Christianity. And it's only in the first half of the second century that we start hearing about people who believe that's the real Jesus, that that's the only Jesus, rather than these being symbolic myths. So it took about 100 years, maybe 50 to 100 years for this transition, and then there may have still been these sort of lesser fringe sects still believing in the angelic Jesus and not the historical Jesus. We have hints of them. I talk about evidence of that in the end of chapter 8 of On the History of the City of Jesus. But none of those sects survive. Just like most other Christian sects, we don't have their literature. We don't have the literature of any other sect, really, like other than just a few fragments of things. But we have almost nothing for most of the Christian sects of the time, except the one that got endorsed by Constantine in the early 4th century. And it's only that sect that decided which books to preserve and talk about. So the evidence has been highly skewed towards this one sect that isn't even faithful to the Pauline Christianity, much less the original Jewish Christianity.
All right. Well said. Do you think, when you look at, I know Dennis McDonald, he has a book that talks about the Greek influence on Mark and the way Mark is written. Reminds him of the Iliad and the Odyssey and all that stuff. And then you have also Craig Evans. He wrote a book about the Essenes' influence on Christianity. Can you speak on the because earlier what you just talked about with Earl Doherty, I was going to ask you about that. So thanks for the question, my brother in the audience. But you're talking about the visions of Isaiah. That's what I was trying to remember. So that's
yes.
Earl Doherty. That's where Earl Doherty stuff, and I'm pretty familiar with it. But we know what we're going to get back to that at the end of the interview, because I want you to elaborate more on the vision of Isaiah, or whatever it's called, and what is your sources, because I think I was on Vidar.info, that blog, and they had talked about the Ethiopian script that was kind of old in the 1st century, and they couldn't date it, could be before 50 AD and so forth. So I want to elaborate on that later, because people need to hear that that version or that theory and why you actually support some of it. I don't know if you support it completely, but it makes a lot of sense to me. That's
Hmm.
what makes the most sense to me. But let's
Yeah.
talk about Craig Evans' book. He talks about the Essenes influence in the early Christians, and then talk about Dennis MacDonald and the Greek influence on Mark.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of influences on the Christian sect. Now, the Christian sect clearly was a fringe countercultural sect. They were a non-elite, anti-elite sect, so they were highly critical of the main four sects. So they were pushing their own sort of agenda, sort of against mainstream Judaism, and so were a lot of the Essenes. So the Essenes actually had multiple sects of their own. There wasn't just one sect of Essenes. And when you go looking at them, a lot of their attributes are very similar. A lot of their teachings are very similar to the teachings we find endorsed at Qumran. The Dead Sea Scrolls appear to have come from either an Essene sect or many sects, one of whom is an Essene sect. So they seem very Essene. The Christians sound a lot like Essenes in a lot of ways. It's definitely true. I mean, teachings on divorce and all kinds of other things just line up very similarly. But there's also influence we see, like in the Gospels, from other sects. So we see a lot of actually Hillelites, which were a sect of the Pharisees. The Jesus who's arguing against the Pharisees in the Gospels sounds a lot like Hillel, the Rabbi Hillel, who was the founder of the liberal school of the Pharisees, when he would argue against the Shammaites, which were the conservative sect of the Pharisees. Jesus is portrayed as arguing against just the Pharisees. But there weren't just the Pharisees. And in fact, if those were real scenes, if Jesus was actually having those arguments, there would have been liberal Pharisees siding with Jesus against the conservative Pharisees. So that's how we know these stories are made up, because that's not realistic at all. That whole interchange of Jesus just battling these Pharisees, and they're only the Shammaites that he somehow only ever encounters. There's never any Hillelites there to like back Jesus up. So that's a fiction that was created to sort of simplify reality for the message that the gospel writers wanted to create. But there are a lot of these different sects. And so I think they all influenced Christianity in different ways. It's hard to say how much each one did, or which sect, for example, Christianity came from. They could have been an Essene shoot-off sect that was influenced by some liberal Pharisaic sects. Like there's a lot of different ways that it could have come about. We just don't have enough data to know. And so it's interesting, though, to trace these connections. And I have a whole section on the historicity of Jesus about these many influences, including pagan influences as well. Stoic and Cynic influences enter into Christianity too.
Bart Ehrman always asks a question about, can we provide somebody in the past that what's his question, saying that if they resurrected and did the things that Jesus did. There's some, you know what, before the show is over, let me get that question properly.
Okay.
There's some question he asks that there's nobody in the past that before Jesus who died. I don't know what he said. They died, resurrected, and was. I don't remember. I'll find the quote before we go. But there's a gentleman in the audience is asking about Luke writing Acts 16 in the first person. What do you think? Hold on, let me get the right question here.
Yeah.
Get it right.
There's
ask Richard about Luke's first person narrative starting in Acts.
There is a segment of the book of Acts where suddenly it drops into the first person. Now, actually, there are multiple texts of Acts that contradict each other, and some of them have more passages that have been converted to the first person plural than others. So there's already a question as to whether the original author actually put those in there, or if someone else was converting them to first person plural, because we have other texts, other manuscripts of Luke where more passages have been converted to the plural of the passages of Acts that have been converted to the plural than is the case in the mainstream version, the one that we use now, or the one that's in your everyday Bible. So there's a lot of different explanations as to why that could be. But one thing we know for sure is the author of Acts does not claim to be among the we that he's talking about. And it was the actual standard of the time. If you were a historian, you were someone who was there, you would say so. And you would say, I was here at this time, and this is what I knew because I was there. And these are the people that I knew. These are my connections. This is why I'm an authority and you should trust me. And this is the case for all the historians we have. At some point in their writings, they actually talk about, this was me and I was there. But it's not there. In fact, Luke, in his preface to the gospel, says he actually says he's not a witness, that he's actually just slavishly preserving the traditions handed down to him that from other people. So he's actually saying he's not a witness. He also doesn't name himself or identify himself. And so when you get to the we passages, the first person plural passages in Acts, they seem to be only thrown in during this one particular Aegean Sea travel narrative. There's a few offshoots from that, but it's one narrative. And so at some points, it uses the first person plural. Now, that was a common device. We know anonymous first person plural was a common device in fiction. First person plural was a common device in travel narratives. So we don't know if that's where it comes from, or if the author of Acts was using a source that was in the first person plural and that they've changed it up. We don't know. It's possible. Or it's possible someone tried to start changing some of the verses into the plural over time, as we see others were doing to other manuscripts of Luke. So we won't really know about that. But the one thing we do know is that the author never at any point says that he was a witness or that he knew Paul or that he was there. That's never stated in the book of Acts.
All right, let me see if we have any more. Let me see. All right, let me going to Marcion. What role do you think Marcion? I mean, when you look at Epiphanius and Tertullian, and folks writing about against Marcion, so we have evidence from them of what his argument was, and so forth.
And we can't always trust them, right? We can't trust them to be telling us the truth, because nothing that Marcion wrote, none of his canon was preserved. We only have what claims by his enemies as to what he taught or what his books were. But what they tell us is that the first Christian canon assembled, the original New Testament, was Marcion's New Testament, and it had certain peculiarities. It had only certain of Paul's letters. It had only one gospel, which is what they claim was a pared down version of the Gospel of Luke. We don't have this canon. We don't have the manuscripts from the canon. We don't have anything from the canon. We have quotations of it or claims about it in Tertullian, for example. But Tertullian's a notoriously dishonest and unreliable writer. So we don't know to what extent he's actually telling us the truth about what was actually in Marcion's canon. So anyway, the evidence of this sect was completely destroyed except for references to them in their enemies. And the interesting thing, though, is that that was the original New Testament, and it was destroyed and erased from history. And the enemies of Marcion, in response to him, invented their own canon to sort of fight Marcion, and that was the anti-Marcionite canon, which is our New Testament, basically. So our New Testament was the sort of second New Testament invented by the enemies of the creators of the original New Testament, which is something that a lot of people don't realize. And this means that it was composed and edited, assembled and edited under a highly polemical atmosphere where they were trying to win an ideological war. So there's a lot to distrust in how honestly or carefully these things were preserved. Because the New Testament we have today was written as a weapon against this other lost New Testament. And so that casts into doubt a lot of how much you should be able to trust it, basically.
Is there a question from the audience? Is there any historical mention of the Jesus character in Ethiopia? Well,
obviously not from before we have Ethiopian language texts.
Right.
Well, let's talk about the Ascension of Isaiah then, because that's a good example. Probably that would be the earliest example. Now that was a text that we have in multiple languages, but we only have a fragment of it in the original language, which was Greek. But we don't have the fragment we want. We have this other fragment of it. So the parts that are important are in all these other languages scattered across the world. And they've different kinds of doctrine. Christians were altering it over time. So it's been messed with. This is a big problem. And so scholars have examined this and compared the different versions to try and reconstruct what the version looked like around what they say between 80 and 120 AD, right the same period when the canonical Gospels in our New Testament were being written. This Gospel was being written. But it was clearly written by a different sect, a sect that believed, when you look at the reconstruction, that removes all of the stuff that was added and altered later. The original version, or that reconstructed version that we can get down to that point, does not have a Jesus reaching earth. It's a Jesus who appears to be crucified and killed by Satan and his demons, in the lower heavens, right below the moon, in the sky castles of Satan and his overlords. This actually is the archangelic Jesus who descends, assumes a body, is killed by demons in another realm, and then ascends, and then he's atoned for all sins, and he acquires this power that he can then reveal to earth apostles and therefore send the apostles forth. So this is a version of Christianity without a historical Jesus, but it got destroyed, clipped, altered, things removed and stuff by the surviving and successful sects of Christianity who didn't like the original message. And one of the most important texts, because it's the longest and the earliest we can reconstruct, is the Ethiopian language text. Now, the Ethiopian Christian Church has a lot of texts that only survive in the Ethiopian. They preserved a lot of things that were destroyed by the mainstream churches in the West and even in the East as well. So we have fuller texts of the Book of Enoch, for example, which is a pre-Christian text that was seminal and regarded as a scripture by the Christians who are building Christianity. So when they cite scripture, they sometimes cite the Enoch or use Enoch as a source because they thought that was a definitive scripture, even though that book did not get into our Old Testament ultimately. But the Ethiopians preserve the longest and most intact version of this, the Book of Enoch. There are many other copies of Enoch in different forms too, fragments and so on. But so the Ethiopian text of the Ascension of Isaiah is our best text. But we have a Slavonic text and a Latin text. They're very similar. And we can show from the history of those texts, because they diverge in their own way. And then you have the Ethiopian text. You can look across all three of them and you can actually reconstruct an earlier version of the text. Now, it's still missing some bits because bits were cut out of all of them. So we don't have the full thing. But when you look, that's how we can reconstruct this sort of what the text looked like in the early 2nd century. But it would have been the Greek text then, not the Ethiopian text. The Ethiopian is just a translation of this doctored version of the text that was early medieval. So the text is complicated. This is why it's very compromised as evidence. It's difficult to work with because of this multiple languages and all this alterations and forgery and meddling with the text and so on. So we would like to be in a better evidential situation with it. But it is one of the few sort of fossils of what I think is the original angelic worshiping Christian sect.
All right. Ask Richard about Joseph Atwell's book, Caesar's Messiah, the Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus. What do you feel about this book? I personally think a couple of points in there might make a little sense, but I'm not a big fan of that book.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of
I would highly recommend people not read it and not quote it at people or cite it. No, Atwill is a bit of a crank, and like all cranks, he might have a few good ideas in there, but they're buried under heaps of really terrible, bad reasoning and conspiracy theory logic and stuff that doesn't make any sense in context, doesn't make sense of the evidence. He clearly has no command of Greek, so he doesn't understand how to read the original languages or make arguments based on the original languages. So he makes a lot of mistakes as a result of this. People who want to know more about this, I actually wrote an article. It's on my blog, so you can go to richardcarrier.info and search just Atwill. But the title of the blog is Atwill's Cranked Up Jesus. And I have a really, a simple section explaining why you can't trust this guy's work, why it's wrong. And then for those who really need more, I have a whole longer section right after that goes into detail showing how he really doesn't know what he's doing, but is really fanatically committed to his conclusions. And this incongruity between not knowing what you're doing, but being absolutely certain you can't be wrong is indicative of cranks, basically. So this is why you can't trust his work.
In the kindest way possible.
Yeah. That was kind.
Very kind. What's Vespasian and Titus' role on the New Testament? That's from Anthony Richardson.
Well, that would be a reference to Caesar's Messiah, right? So that's Atwill's theory. Atwill's crank theory is that the Flavians, which would be Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, and that family, commissioned Josephus to forge the entire New Testament to somehow trick Jews into becoming pacifists. The theory is ridiculous on so many levels, but there's no evidence it's true. So there's no connection whatsoever, really. And we actually don't have any references that connect Titus or Vespasian to Christians or Christianity at all until you get weird legends way later, hundreds of years later, that have no reliable sources.
I will say though that the Vespasian did go into the temples in Egypt And he did heal somebody with, I think,
That's right.
spit,
Yeah.
right?
Famously,
Serapis Christus. He called on Serapis.
yes.
And then he worked a miracle, and the same miracles are actually in the biblical text with Jesus. So that's what he uses as a linchpin to say, hey, here's a connection. So let's
Yeah. But that kind of thing was common. We have tons of examples of those kinds of faith healing events. So there's nothing peculiar there at all.
All right. What does he feel about the Gnostic Gospels?
That's an interesting question. For the longest time, for about the past 10 years, I've settled on the conclusion that Gnosticism is a fake category that was invented by modern scholars, that it does not correspond to anything that existed in the ancient world. Which is not to say that the ideas that of the modern version of Gnosticism, that this modern theory, that the ideas of that did not exist in the ancient world. They existed, and they were scattered amongst many Christian sects. But there was no such thing as a Gnostic Christian sect. There were a bunch of very divergent sects that had a bunch of weird ideas. None of them all lined up. So there wasn't one consistent, like, say there's a Gnostic Christianity and an anti-Gnostic Christianity. Didn't exist. There was just a variety of different Christianities. Some of these ideas that got stuffed under the label of Gnostic exist in some of these sects. Even in Paul, you can find some things that seem similar to what were assumed to be these quote Gnostic teachings. But that category didn't exist in the ancient world. There's no reference to Gnostics in the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christian writing. It's even the anti-heresy literature does not talk about Gnostics as a thing. It's not a sect. And it doesn't really categorize sects under the category of Gnostics either. That's a modern invention. And that was my conclusion that I'd reached throughout my research. So I decided to not even bring that up in my work. Now, it turns out I'm going to be joining the panel for the Westar Institute, which people will recognize as the Jesus Seminar. That's actually the Westar Institute. And I'm actually a fellow of the Westar Institute. So, in a sense, I'm technically a fellow of the Jesus Seminar, although the Jesus Seminar is retired and gone. That was finished ages ago before I joined. But their new seminar, the one they're working on now, is Origins of Christianity. And one of the pillars they've come to conclude, and this is a committee of a whole bunch of biblical scholars of high levels all over the world. So this is not some trivial thing. This is a large committee of people and a voting society of scholars who really know what they're doing and are significant figures in the field. The widespread conclusion to very high consensus, I think nearly like over 90%, like 95% or more, agrees with me. They say that like Gnosticism is a dead category. It was a false creation of modern scholarship. We got to get rid of the idea of Gnosticism and move on. So there wasn't a such thing. What I just said about Gnosticism is what conclusion they've come to, and are soon going to endorse that through a vote, and then they'll have a publication eventually. But all these pillars of how Christian origins have to be re-understood, all these ways scholarship has changed, and one of them is they're ditching Gnosticism as a concept. So that's the story of the Gnostics.
Okay, let me ask you this here. Ask Dr. Carrier if the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus is historical, as far as does it have historical information on Jesus?
The what gospel?
Yeah, Aquarian Gospel.
I don't know what that is.
Oh, okay. Well,
you mean Q?
No, it's really a crazy question. I know the answer, but I'm gonna let you answer. Really, Aquarian Gospel is something that
really called the Aquarian Gospel.
Yeah, in the 19th century, this guy came up with it.
Oh, okay.
To India and all this craziness happening. One of the groups that we have in our community holds on to this information, and
yeah, I see it there. It's on Wikipedia. Even has a whole entry. Yeah, that wasn't even on my radar. That's obvious late bogus stuff. So,
wow. I guess your question is answered, buddy.
There was something not related to that, but someone was telling me that there were these passages. So there's this literature in the Middle Ages where they're basically literature about heretics and people that they're interrogating and the stuff they learned from torturing them, and they write it all down. So there's these books about like what these heretics said, and there was someone claimed like that people were interrogating these Cathars, and they have so Cathars are a particular kind of a Christian sect in a way. And some of the things that they were saying under torture sound a lot like the angelic Christianity I was talking about, like a mythicist-based Christianity. And I was intrigued by that. And I went and looked. I even looked at the original language, because it's in Latin, this stuff. And it didn't hold up. But it was interesting that there were some of these heretics in the Middle Ages being interrogated that were saying things about how the scriptures are allegorical, how Jesus is this angelic being, and so on. Now, they never explicitly say that he was never a historical person. So you can't say that these guys were anti-historicists. But it is interesting that you can look at some of this heresy literature from the Middle Ages and pick out some things that clearly survived for a very long time in these dying fringe sects of Christianity. Lasted 1,000 years, enough for this to be repeated under torture.
What's the name? What's the name of the group? Do you have a reference where we could look it up? Or
reference for what I'm talking about? No, it's the Cathars. You can look up Cathars. Catharism.
Okay.
And that connects to Gnosticism, because they were actually categorized as a Gnostic sect, but now we know Gnostics don't exist. So, but they have teachings similar to what modern scholars thought Gnostics taught. And so you can look at it. Wikipedia has a good article, actually, Catharism. If you just type Cathars, it'll send you there. So it's Cathar, Cathar. And, but yeah, so the specific texts I'm talking about, I don't have off the top of my head where they are. I've got them in my files somewhere. I recorded all the research I did on it, but it was a dead end ultimately. But the point being is that sometimes you can find these things that you can confirm existed these teachings that existed way, way further back in the ancient times. That does not mean that if you find some of this stuff that you can't confirm exists in the ancient world, that it did exist in the ancient world. And that's the big frustration of ancient history, is like, sometimes you might find stuff like in the Middle Ages, like in 1100 AD. Oh, that's amazing. If that actually was believed in 1st century AD, that would change everything. But you can't actually confirm that it was. So it's a dead end. And unfortunately, as a historian, you just have to let that go. And I think a lot of people get a little too excited by finding things in the Middle Ages and thinking that it goes back to the ancient times. And you can't establish that it does. And so it might have done, it probably didn't. But yeah, so there's a lot of stuff in the Middle Ages that really came up in the Middle Ages. But some stuff did survive. But you have to be able to confirm it with attestation in the ancient documents too.
Do you feel two things? Do you feel Constantine nationalizing Christianity and the Arabs actually taking over in the 8th century or the late 7th century? Do you think those things kind of catapulted Christianity's popularity because of the persecutions of the Arabs and the fact that Constantine made it nationalized as far as pushing Christianity, saying, hey, we don't have to fight wars anymore. We could just basically send our religion? Because
I mean, obviously, if that actually isn't what he used it for, and if he did, it didn't succeed, because there's constant state of war ever since. But I can't comment on Islam, so I don't know enough about medieval Islam to remark on that aspect of it. You would want to find someone who's an expert in medieval Arabic studies who could probably
hold on, Richard. Let me stop you again, ladies and gentlemen. Pay attention to what he just did. He's not an expert on Islam. So
I know some things, but not enough about this particular subject to have a useful thing. But Constantine, what Constantine did is he clearly did want to use the church to control the empire, but he wanted the church to get along with pagans. So he did start looting funds from pagan churches and giving them to Christian churches. So he started doing that, started favoring Christians in government and the military and things like that. So he saw Christianity as a useful tool. But it wasn't until his descendant, almost a century later, Theodosius, in 395. So Constantine died around 330. Theodosius passed his decree in 395. So 65 years later, the Theodosian decree outlawed all other religion. It said, you better be a Christian. That's the only religion for you. And so that's when Christianity became kind of the definitive religion. And then after that, that's when you start to see more and more of these sort of brutal riots against the pagans. So because you had people ignoring the law. So you had, like, in Gaza and in Alexandria, There were pagans still basically being pagans, and this really irked Christians. And so there were riots and pogroms and things like this to try and suppress the pagans because they were outraged that they were defying the law, basically, or skirting the laws, skirting the letter of the law, as it were. So it was really the end of the 4th century that Christianity became. You'd better be Christian or else, is basically how it became. And as it spread through Europe, it was the same thing. Like, they would go to a kingdom, tell the king, basically, you can be our ally or we'll come and destroy you. Oh, by the way, if you're going to be our ally, you have to convert to Christianity and convert all your people to Christianity. And usually people would follow their king. So they would go in, threaten the king. King would convert to become an ally. The people would convert to go along with their king, because that was the condition of the alliance. And so there was these kinds of tactics used. And if people resisted, by the way, if they said no, Christians would go in and kill them off. So until they complied. So this use of force and this assigning of privileges. So you had more chances of advancement. You had a better situation in society if you became a Christian. And so these things clearly sealed the deal for making Europe Christian. And the holdouts were, very few, and usually hidden in the rural sticks where, the authorities had a harder time policing, which the rural districts were called the Pagani, or the Pagoi. They were called the Pagoi, and the people who lived in the Pagoi were the Pagani, hence pagans. And it was the people who lived in the rural districts who held on to these old religions that the Christians had to come out there and sort of suppress, or try to cajole or suppress or bribe or whatever the case was. And that's where the concept of the word pagan comes from, is the reference to these rural hicks who are resisting Christianity, sticking to their old religion. And so it's actually a pejorative in a sense, the word pagan. It's just become normal to refer to polytheism under the Greeks and Romans as paganism.
A question about the original, hold on, what is he saying? He's asking if the name Jesus originally in Hebrew is like how the Hebrew Israelites say it. What was Jesus' name in
Yeshua.
Hebrew? Yeshua. Okay.
Yeah, Jesus is the English, corrupted reading of the Latin Jesus, which is the Latinization of the Greek Jesus, which is the Greek transliteration of Yeshua, which is, the Aramaic and Hebrew. It means Joshua, right? It's the same word. It's exactly the same. If you look at the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, used by the Jews even, all the Joshuas in there are translated Jesus. It's the same. It's the exact same word. There wasn't any difference between the words back then. So if people heard Jesus, they knew that you meant Joshua. Jesus Christ is really Joshua Christ.
Right. All right. A lot of people talk about whether Jesus existed, but what about Paul? What do you want to tell the community that's listening to you right now? What about Paul? Because majority of the people in my community don't believe Paul is a real person. I do believe there's some sense of the writings there, 50 AD and so forth. But what do you have to tell us about Paul?
Yeah, there have been a few scholars, very, very few, who questioned the historicity of Paul, but that entails a massive and implausible type of forgery. The letters of Paul don't make sense as forgeries, except the ones that are forgeries, which is how we know they're forgeries, right? So there are several letters of Paul in the New Testament that mainstream scholars agree are forged. They weren't written by Paul. They were written in a different style, and they have different teachings in them, and there's slightly different use of vocabulary and theology and things. But the authentic letters of Paul look like random pastiches of other letters, and clearly were written by someone who was unaware of the Jewish war, which means they had to have been written before the 60s AD, and the traditional date of them is the 50s AD. So that's exactly when they appear to have been written. It lines up. So whether he was really called Paul, I think is like a trivial distinction. So what his name really was is not something worth arguing about. Clearly, someone in the 50s was writing these letters to actual churches, dealing with actual problems and defending himself against actual accusations. So in that sense, there certainly was a historical Paul. It's not plausible, I think, to sort of reconstruct it otherwise. And for people who want to know more about this as to why this holds up, I do have a whole blog on it at my blog at richardcarrier.info. You can just type in historicity of Paul, and I have a whole article on why we probably shouldn't doubt the historicity of Paul. Now, having said that, there is something more interesting to talk about with Paul, which is that we know the Christians outside the Roman Empire were teaching that Jesus lived and died 100 years earlier than our Gospels claim. They have him dying under Alexander Jannaeus, or right after the end of the reign of Alexander Jannaeus. In other words, in the 70s BC. And we know this because that's the only version of Christianity that the Babylonian Talmud knows about. It's the only, when you look at the Jewish Talmud, the ancient rabbis, the only version of Christianity they knew was a Christianity preaching that Jesus was stoned for sorcery in Joppa, not Jerusalem, 100 years before Pontius Pilate. And we know from Epiphanius. Epiphanius talks about this group, the Nazarians, these Torah observant Christians. So it's clearly the earliest sect of Christianity. And in some obscure way, he links them with the belief that Jesus lived right after Alexander Jannaeus. It's unclear as to how he's connecting this, but he puts a whole section in there about this genealogy explaining Jesus lived right after Jannaeus, which puts him in the 70s BC. And he talks about this in the section. He talks about the Nazarians. So we know there's this Christian sect out there that's preaching Jesus 100 years before, which would put Paul in the 50s BC. And in fact, if you look at the letters of Paul, they actually do fit the 50s BC equally as well as the 50s AD, if not better in some respects. So there is an argument to be made. Now, I don't think it's convincing, but it's certainly not crazy. It is a plausible argument to explore as to whether Christianity actually began in the 70s BC, and Paul actually lived and wrote in the 50s BC, and that all this stuff got ported back to the first century when they wanted to rewrite the myths and set it into a Roman setting at a particular time that they wanted for their prophetic timetables and things like that.
How does the listen? I think I read that in G.S. Mead. G.S. Mead was one that taught me about the Epiphanius writing about 70.
Yeah,
I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah, that's a really, really old scholarship, though. So I would use it with huge caution. I would use Mead with huge caution. But think some of that does hold up, and that's what I'm explaining now. And I talk about this right at the beginning of chapter 8 of On the Historicity of Jesus. I look at the stuff that I actually was able to confirm myself, and that's all in there. So if you want to see the stuff that I was able to confirm, it's there. Now, that doesn't mean it's true. It just means that there was this sect of Christians, and they were preaching this. Why they were preaching that, where that belief came from, we don't know. When that belief arose, we don't know, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was reading about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Teach of Righteousness. They was trying to link the Teach of Righteousness with that time period also with Alexander Jannaeus. It makes a lot of sense too.
There's a lot of ways that you can make that work, but that just makes it plausible, not proven, which is the difficult, frustrating thing that we have to deal with a lot as ancient historians. There's lots of things that are possible that we just can't really nail down.
I know you spoke about Atwell earlier, but what do you think about there's certain hints in the New Testament of things that Josephus wrote from, that he looked like a dependent, like the New Testament writers were dependent on certain things. There's a story about, I think, Theudas, and where they introverted the guy, they put one before one, and then there's a couple other things, but that's just off the top of the head.
Yeah, it's an amusing one. They're actually more than that. Like, so when we were talking about Jesus ben Ananias earlier, now that story is told in Josephus's Jewish War, which was written about 75, 76 AD. And Mark appears to be using Josephus's plot model of that, which would suggest that Mark is using the Jewish War. So Mark would have written after 75 or 76, right? So that's tantalizing as it is. Now, but it's in the Jewish Antiquities that Josephus talks about all these other things, tons of other stuff. And it's in Luke Acts. So the book of Luke, as 2-volume set, Luke and Acts. If you look across all of it, it draws material like what you would call local color, like this names of magistrates and events, things that happened and stuff like this, just pulled right out of Josephus and put into Luke's plot, but screwed up oftentimes, not exactly accurate all the time. But it looks, and vocabulary and concepts and other things. So it looks very much, in fact, I think it's pretty certain that Luke, as an author, was using the Antiquities of the Jews as a sort of source text to fill out his books. Now, the Antiquities of the Jews is written in 93 AD, because it says so. which is one thing that's different between other books and the Gospels. Is that books like Josephus's works actually say when they were written. The Gospels do not. But it was written in 93, so which means Luke, Acts has to have been written after. So no earlier than the 90s. Could have been 10, 20 years later than that even. But one of the really clincher pieces of evidence for this is that we know it was other examples where Luke follows Josephus but kind of screws things up. So he's not really following closely. He's just sort of skimming Josephus, grabbing material and using it, and he kind of messes things up sometimes. And one of them is this. So he has Gamaliel give a speech in the 40s AD about these other Jewish rebels movements that are moving up and were suppressed by the Romans. And the gist of the speech is, well, look at all these other movements have happened. They all died out because they were fake. They were fakes. And so if this Christianity is not a true religion, it'll die out too. So just let it go, kind of thing. That's kind of the speech argument. But the problem is that he tells the sequence of events where he says Theudas and then Judas and these other. He names these in the Egyptian. He mentions these Jewish rebel leaders, these messianic figures, in fact. But he gets not only does he get the order wrong, he puts Theudas a decade before the Egyptian. Like he puts Theudas earlier. But in fact, Theudas wasn't active until 10 years after the speech of Gamaliel. So there's no way the speech could have been delivered. So this proves that Luke is inventing this speech. And he screwed up the history. He's got the wrong order of Jewish rebels, and he's got the wrong decade in which they happen. They happen a decade later than this speech even. So, but the big clincher on this is that Josephus discusses these leaders in the order that Luke gives them, but Josephus is clear in backdating them because he does it like a flashback. He has them in the sequence Luke uses, but he carefully explains like, oh, well, before this one, there was this one, right? So Josephus is clear in his chronology, but Luke missed that part. He was just skimming. He saw the order of them in Josephus and just put them in the mouth of Gamaliel, didn't check dates to confirm that Gamaliel's speech actually lined up with any of this. But this mistake really can only be explained by Luke using Josephus and screwing it up. Like there's no other reason why Luke would think Theudas would come earlier than the Egyptian or earlier than Gamaliel even, unless he was misreading Josephus, and because Josephus's order is that. So you can explain how he would make this mistake if you assume that he's using the Antiquities of the Jews. So it's one of the best pieces of evidence I find that Luke Acts, the author of Luke Acts, is relying on the Antiquities of Josephus and not very carefully.
All right. Let me see if there's any more questions here. I mean, I have tons of questions, but I don't want to hog. Yeah, I want to hog the mic. Are
we aiming to wrap by 9:30? Is that the plan?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's definitely fine. Let me see what else we have here. All right, let me go to this here, to my question sheet. What do you feel about the whole, hold on there, let me see here. Have you ever thought about debating James White, or have you debated him before?
I don't think so, but I'm not sure. I think someone said I had. I don't know. If I did, it was so long ago I don't remember it. Yeah, maybe. Again, I'm not sure. I'd have to check up on what he's been claiming lately. Yeah. I have an issue. Like I'll debate pretty much almost anyone, but certain people engage in sort of wanton lying and ad hominem. They're just such loathsome people that I will not debate them. Now, I don't know if James White is one of those people, but I would have to check first before agreeing to debate him. Probably he's fine, but
that reminds me of the gentleman that debated Bart Ehrman in 2000. Was it 11 and 12? And he mentioned the Mark manuscripts, and I know who
you mean.
Yeah, he's the guy that run the New Testament manuscripts website.
Watson?
No, not Watson. Wow, what's his name again?
He started the whole urban legend of the first century manuscript of Mark.
Right.
Which I have an article on. Yes, that's been a mummy gospel. That's what I call it. Yeah, if you go to my website, richardcarrier.info, type in mummy gospel, because originally he was claiming that this gospel was taken from mummy wrapping. Wallace. It was Wallace.
Wallace, right.
Yeah.
Wallace.
Yeah. Well, he's now mea culpa'd on that. He has now admitted that he was completely wrong about everything, and there wasn't such a manuscript. He made a mistake, basically. So
I think the manuscript is dated for what, the 3rd century instead of the 4th?
Yeah, it's so late second, early third, I think is the earliest date it could have.
But that was a real big gap. But I think he did that because, I mean, that debate, he's not like he was winning or anything. He just pulled that one out, boy. Like, let everybody talk about it. And everybody was talking about it for years.
And it was really bad form, right? So he's claiming like, well, I'm going to refute. He's in an oral debate with Bart Ehrman, a fellow scholar who Bart Ehrman, I mean, say what you will about like how he makes mistakes in some aspects of his work. His primary field is manuscripts. Like this paleography, that's his fucking thing, you know, like so that's one area where Bart Ehrman knows his stuff. And so for Wallace in that debate to say, well, I'm just going to refute everything you just said by saying we have a 1st century manuscript of Mark, and Ehrman's blindsided by this. Like, I've never heard of this. It's not under peer review. How do I know that this thing is true? Like that's the kind of thing you should never, like, ethically, you just don't bring that up in a debate, because the other person has obviously not had a chance to review it. And this is the kind of thing that the scholarly community needs a chance to review it. It needs to go through peer review. You can't just make wild claims about these amazing new archaeological finds that haven't been confirmed by anyone relevant. So it was a very bad form, I found, of him to use that argument. And he should be ashamed of himself for doing that. That's the kind of thing you sit on it until it's been confirmed, until you've got peer-reviewed confirmation of it. And of course, you know, the problem is they were so antsy they couldn't sit on it because it was sitting unvetted for years and years and years, and they kept saying, well, next year, never got published. And then finally, and that created all this controversy, this huge thing. And then finally, you know, it gets published or is near to publishing now. And the revelation is, oh no, it was published. That's right. The revelation is that it wasn't from a mummy, did not come from mummy wrapping, and was not 1st century. So yeah. And then there's actually more mystery surrounding it too, like allegations of people trying to sell it and like all kinds of stuff. So
yeah, the whole provenance and all that stuff.
Yeah. There's issues, and it's linked into the Green family, which is the Hobby Lobby family that has the new Bible Museum in DC. Like there's stuff like suggestions of that, but it's not linked to them, or it was linked to them. So it's like there's all kinds of weird questions still looming about this thing. But one thing we do now is that there is no 1st century manuscript of Mark that anyone knows about.
Let me ask you this. With all the manuscripts being over past 800 AD, when we find most of the actual manuscripts,
Yeah.
because they always like to brag about having 5,000, almost 6,000.
Yeah.
Manuscripts are older than 800 AD. Do you think between 800 AD and 1500 AD, do we find, you know, like how Origen had the hexapla? Do we find anybody doing like what Origen did during that time period between the 7th century AD to 1500 AD?
You know, I don't know. I can't answer that question. I'm not sure. Yeah, not sure.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about one. Let me see. We're gonna get out in 3 minutes. If there's any more questions, family, now is the time to get your questions in.
Yeah.
All right. There was a question that I did see in the chat and I went over. Well, let me do this. All right. So a couple of people a couple of things are important to me in my growth when it comes to this type of studies. Is so basically, before you leave, can you explain to everybody your whole thesis as far as how Jesus is concerned, and where do you think it came from? Just break down the whole Isaiah vision of Isaiah, and that we could close the show that way.
Yeah, I mean, Well, I won't go much further into the vision of Isaiah as a text. People who want to know more about that, everything is in On the Historicity of Jesus. I go into it in chapter 3. I've said enough about that already. That if that's anything, it would be evidence of this other sect of Christianity. But by itself, it does not establish that that was the original sect of Christianity. It could have been like a later sect of Christianity. So by itself, it's not. It's a proof of concept. It shows that there were Christians preaching these kinds of things, but it doesn't show that those were the original Christians. So that still has to be theory. Now, the fact of the matter is we have almost no literature or no documentation for the first century of Christianity. So we know very little for the first 100 years even what was going on in the church, what the different sects were, what their debates were, what their disputes were, what their views were. And we can't build a precise chronology at all. And this is true even if historicity is the case. So it's like even historicists can't do this either. It's all very vague. It's all very uncertain. And most of the information is lost. Almost all of it is gone. And what we do have, all of it has been compromised. All of it's been edited, doctored, errors have been entered into it, and so on. So it's all messed up, which is really problematic. And this is true even if Jesus existed. This is not even a mythicism versus historicity issue. So that's the problem we're facing. So what we got to do is that we got to look at like detectives and say, well, let's have a hypothesis. Like this is how it started and this is how it happened. Historicists have to do the same way too. Like who was Jesus really? How did he get this started? How do we explain the evidence? And there's a dozen different theories that are all being proposed in the field, and we can't tell the difference between any of them in terms of which one's more likely, or very little. Like the evidence is always wishy-washy in terms of they all make sense, they're all plausible, and so on. What I'm proposing is we can add one more theory to this mix of these competing theories, and it's the view that Christianity started with visions. So when Paul says Jesus, we know Jesus died and was resurrected according to the scriptures, he's saying we know that from the scriptures. And then when he says, then Jesus appeared to people, he means that's the first time Jesus ever appeared to anyone, that they saw him in visions as the risen Christ, appearing them to heaven, telling them that this cosmic death and resurrection has occurred, and that it therefore solves all of their spiritual problems, and so on. So it started with these visions, dreams, or pretended visions, and finding secret messages in scripture. And that was the original sect. But even in the letters of Paul, we see there were tons of different sects splitting off from this, teaching different things, and making the claim that Jesus was teaching different things or having different theologies. Paul himself is one of these offshoots where he's gentilizing, allowing Gentiles into the church. And so he's changing the theology and claiming Jesus appeared to him in a vision or a dream and told him he could do this. And so that was the original Christianity. Now it started solidifying over time, over the next 100 years, one sect of which ended up collecting a bunch of these books in the 2nd century to fight against these other sects. And that one sect had bought into the idea that there was an actual Galilean Jesus, that the gospel Jesus was a real Jesus, not a symbolic character representing these things. And that's the sect that ultimately got picked by Constantine and ultimately got to choose which books to preserve, how to doctor them, how to edit them, and so on. So that's the basic gist of that thesis of how that happened. And if you want to see how that makes sense, I have a section in chapter 12 of On the Historicity of Jesus that really quickly summarizes why this makes sense. And the whole book looks at the evidence of it, pro and con, all the way through. But I also have that blog article I mentioned, like how did Christianity transition? How did it change to a historical Jesus? And that talks about that.
Dr. Carrier, can you tell us what is your blog right now so we could post it in the chat?
You bet. richardcarrier.info. So that's okay. Richard Carrier, all one word, .info. And you can find everything there. Look down the right margin. You'll find links to my books, my app, all kinds of things. You can go exploring down there. And then the blog itself is there, and links to my Twitter feed and Facebook and all that.
Before you go, 2 questions. Serapis and Egyptian connection to the Jesus story and the New Testament. Can you talk about those 2 things?
Not really, because I don't think there's strong connections. The only connections are proof of concept, that there are elements of syncretism in the creation of Serapis as a god that we also see play out in Christianity, but I don't think they directly influence each other.
Okay. What about Egyptian influence as far as Heru and
Yeah, that's one thing. I talk about the parallels with Osiris cult, right? In On the Historicity of Jesus, and there are some elements that seem to creep into the Gospels from the Osiris story, but only some like little elements. There's not a lot of influence. I think the majority of the Jesus of the Gospels and Christianity as a theology, most of it is built out of Judaism, using this skeletal model of savior cults, which were all over the Roman Empire, not just the Osiris cult. That was just a neighboring province one. But there are parallels, but the parallels are not necessarily direct influences. They're just reflections of common trends that Christianity also represents. So like Osiris cult had the same thing where they had stories putting Osiris as a pharaoh in history and writing gospels about him, like walking around and having teachings and stuff like that, and then being killed on earth and so on, and being resurrected on earth. But the true teachings, and we know Plutarch tells us this, is that was all symbolic allegory, that Osiris was never a historical person. He was always a celestial being whose death and resurrection was affected by their version of Satan in the lower heavens, just like we see in the ascension of Isaiah for Jesus. So you can see the parallels there, but they just represent common trends. It doesn't necessarily mean that Christians borrowed Osiris cult. It just means that these trends were very common in a lot of other sects, and when the Christians started developing their religion, they followed a lot of the same fads and trends and constructed everything.
But isn't that the same thing with the Old Testament though, with the ancient
Yeah.
Near stories?
Oh yeah. Yes. The parallels. Yes, you find that. Although even there, you find even more direct borrowing. Like the whole Noah and flood story is clearly just a revamp of earlier flood stories that we get from Mesopotamia. Yeah, and you could find many examples of Old Testament stuff is just a ripoff of earlier things, and that's even clearer parallels than in the Gospels.
All right, let me get one. Let me see if I could sneak in one last question. We're in overtime right now, family.
Yeah.
Let me see. What are we looking at? Okay, study. Let me see. How did Christianity become unorthodox, and how did Ethiopians begin to practice it? Don't worry about it. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. I could answer that later. Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
I could answer that. But you know what? I just want to say thank you for coming on, man. I really appreciate you taking out the time out of your busy schedule to come on and share some information, a wealth of information that you had. And you actually made a connection for me today that's very good. The one with the Babylonian Talmud and the story about the 70 BC. So that's that's something that was very important that I overlooked. So thank you.
Yeah. No, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So we will do this again, because I know everybody's going to want you to come back. It's a pleasure to have you on. And again, man, thanks for the opportunity. And to everybody who's watching, peace and one love, family. I'm going to stop the broadcast right now. Peace.